He walked out of the building with a cardboard box on Christmas Eve, the cheap office lights reflecting off the plastic ribbon on a wreath, as if the world insisted on celebrating in the same breath it humiliated him. The box was full of tools: a torque wrench, a worn engineering notebook, a coffee mug with a chip in the rim, and a framed photo of a small family in front of a lake. He had carried that picture into every major meeting for a decade. That night, someone else in the room simply watched him put it in the box. 3 weeks before, they had toasted him. Victoria had praised his prototype at the holiday party and told clients he was the mind behind the breakthrough that had saved the quarter. Victoria had once shared his bed and a life. She had been his wife years earlier, a partner at home and in the early days of the company. They divorced long before the press conferences and the glossy investor decks, but their histories remained tangled. Shared accounts, shared trust, the kind of familiarity that made betrayal feel surgical and personal. On Christmas Eve, in front of colleagues who shuffled awkwardly and a receptionist who pretended not to look, a human resources manager read the words that ended his career there: gross misconduct and intellectual property misappropriation. The charge was clinical, the delivery colder. Victoria sat stone-faced at the head table. When he met her eye, she did not look ashamed. She looked resolved. He came home with the cardboard box and a new kind of silence. The apartment smelled like Eleanor's herbal tea and the antiseptic tang of chemotherapy. Eleanor, who had stood by him since his first patent application, lifted her face from the sofa and smiled, because she always smiled for him, even when the lines at the hospital had gotten longer. Thomas, 22, quick with a calculation and quicker with a sarcasm that masked bruises he refused to show, closed the tablet he had been tinkering with and put his hand on his father's shoulder. They sat at the small kitchen table in the glare of a single lamp. Outside, the Christmas lights blinked as if nothing had happened. "When they took you," Arthur said finally, voice low, "they took more than a job." Eleanor reached for his hand. "We still have each other," she said. It was the kind of answer people living middle-of-the-night answers give. It was true and thin, like tissue paper. What followed was a collapse that did not look dramatic from the outside, but felt like a controlled demolition from within. The firing led to a blacklist in their industry. Reputation, after all, is a currency sometimes worth more than the mortgage. Consultations cost money they no longer had. Appeals and countersuits took months and returned nothing. Insurance lapsed because the company that had once insured them said private litigations and unpaid premiums were cause for immediate cancellation. Eleanor's treatment slowed. Tests were delayed. The oncologist's voice on the phone became a rhythm of bad news. 6 months after the cardboard box, Eleanor died in a county hospital, while snow tapped the windows like an accusatory clock. Arthur stood at her graveside and felt the world shrink to a point. The winter air cut through his coat. The funeral flowers looked bright and deliberate against their muted choice of grave marker. Thomas folded his arms around himself and then around his father. For a long time there was only the sound of wind and the small, childish whisper of the headstones. "I can't make this disappear," Arthur said to the dirt and to the photo of Eleanor's smile. "But I won't let her work mean nothing." For a week after the funeral, he drifted through rooms in their home, touching nothing, answering no calls. On a morning when even the dog refused to get out of bed, he told Thomas something he had not said aloud before. "I had to be careful with myself after she left the hospital. There were nights—" He did not finish. The silence finished it for him. A man at the edge of a grave is not always a man in motion. Thomas, then barely an adult, stepped in like a young strategist. He had watched his father for years, learning the patience of an engineer and the stubbornness of a man who could not let a problem go unresolved. "You won't be doing anything that breaks the law," Thomas said, blunt as a lesson from a math textbook. "But you can fight them where they live, on paper, in banks, in votes. We can make noise where votes count." The vow took shape not as a shouted promise, but as a list in the margins of Arthur's notebook. Find the truth, expose the lie, make it costly enough that no one else would try the same thing. He did not speak of vengeance with the relish of a novel. He spoke of justice with the slow gravity of someone who had already counted the cost. Year 1. He did what he could for work: short-term consulting, teaching a night class at the community college, selling a few patents he could still control. Thomas took 2 jobs, a day job at a small tech supply house, and nights cataloging online share offerings and reading filings. They ate cheap, slept less, and kept a bank account named modestly and privately War Fund, the name more for their eyes than anyone else's. Arthur taught Thomas how to read an annual report the same way he taught him how to read a temperamental lathe,
listen for the consistent noises, and ignore the theatrics. Year 3. Small moves accrued. A handful of shares bought here, a small stake in a new supplier there. They established holding companies that purchased stock without fanfare. The purchases were lawful, pedestrian even, open market buys, prudent investments. They did not storm the gates. They walked each hedge and each purchase to the gatekeepers of law and currency, because the gatekeepers are what would make their victory legitimate. Arthur insisted on counsel. Every step had a lawyer's name attached to it. Year 5.
The numbers were modest, a percentage here, another there. Investors in family businesses often miss the slow compounding of patient buys. Institutions move faster and trade differently. But patience sorts things out. Arthur and Thomas watched their percentages grow like a slow tide. The kitchen table was replaced by a small office above a laundromat that Thomas rented for them, a place where they could make calls without suspicion. They pasted Eleanor's photo on the wall above the desk. It was the only decoration aside from a framed magazine cover they had saved from the year Victoria had announced the new product line. Her smile on that cover was confident, practiced. Hers and his were separate faces now on the same glossy page. Year 7. Margaret Chen appeared in their lives at the most unlikely moment, a former design coordinator who had quietly archived paperwork others had shredded. She had been one of those careful people who guessed the future by keeping copies of the past. Margaret had left Peyton Industries 2 years earlier when she could no longer stomach the rewriting of credit. She brought a folder, printed and annotated in a hand that did not belong to a company lawyer. Inside were dated memos, early prototypes annotated in margins with Arthur's handwriting, and emails that carried the timestamp of real origin, not the sanitized timestamp of some later public relations narrative. "Why bring this to me?" Arthur asked, looking through the folder at a picnic of evidence and regret. Margaret's eyes steadied. "Because you always said credit is a thing that keeps the world honest," she said. "And because you and I both know what happens when people rewrite the ledger." There was no movie-style reveal of these papers. They were pieces of paper. They were proofs and footprints. Margaret's testimony required corroboration and authentication. Forensics could verify file dates and server logs. Arthur and Thomas knew that raw feeling of vindication meant little without a chain of custody and a jurisdiction that would take it seriously. Douglas Peyton came next, smaller than the name he bore, but with an internal gravity he could not hide. He was Victoria's younger brother, a board member who had always regarded his sister's appetite for power with a mix of admiration and worry. Years of family dynamics had left him estranged, resentful, then plainly afraid. The company's culture had not been kind, and he had watched decisions made in the dimmer corners of boardrooms rather than at the light of reason. He had watched the accounting flex like a muscle to suit demands. Douglas found them in a diner at dawn, running from a storm. He slid into their booth with a folded envelope and a careful face. "I don't want to hurt my family," he said, "but I can't stand watching what she's done to people." They continued to buy legally, to maintain reserve funds, to keep Margaret's originals safe in a secure location with notarized copies and a lawyer's stamp. They supplied what they had to federal investigators when the investigators asked. The Department of Justice and securities regulators have their own slow machinery and their own standards. Arthur understood that. He had no interest in making the law look like a toy he could play with. He wanted it to be the mechanism that corrected wrongs. Margaret's testimony and Douglas's corroborations were compelling when gathered by professionals who knew how to present evidence: authenticated memos, server logs showing document creation, signatures matched to known handwriting. When these facts met a prosecutor's interest, when they aligned with a separate audit that showed financial irregularities, the case moved from paper to indictments. The agents who came to interview had their own faces and their own rules. Criminal referrals, subpoenas, and sealed warrants replaced the quiet buying and the family grief. That kind of institutional gravity is not theatrical. It is a long bureaucratic choreography that can last months. There was a moment, though, when law met theater because the world decided to watch. Late in the afternoon of a weekday that smelled of rain and toner, Victoria issued a statement announcing she would divest a chunk of her shares to cover a looming margin call. The call had roots in the acquisition she had pushed and the debt she had taken personally to fund it. It was the kind of human error that arrogance sometimes begets. The shares she put on the market would tip ownership if bought by a single hand. Arthur and Thomas did not orchestrate the sale. They had prepared for a moment where outside forces would make a person vulnerable. They had arranged financing for a legal purchase through legitimate channels, ensuring every dollar was verifiable, every loan documented, every account above board.
The final shares went to an entity Thomas had set up years earlier, not as a weapon but as a legitimate investment firm whose aim was to stabilize and then reform, not to pillage. When the dust settled, the ledger read 51.
But truth, when wrapped properly, can be dramatic by its own nature. "Good morning," he said, and the room bent to hear. His voice did not tremble. Margaret was there, sitting in the second row with a blue notebook. Douglas had arranged to fly in and sat stiff, hands knotted. The board, mostly shocked into a kind of stunned silence, watched the process with the same curiosity they had once reserved for product demos. Arthur began not with accusation, but with evidence. He displayed, through counsel and through a verified chain of custody, the original blueprints and dated drafts that showed his contributions. He let a forensic specialist explain file metadata in sensible terms, not as a monologue of tech speak, but as a narration of a timeline: drafts, revisions, emails, the movements of documents across servers. The images on the projector were not angry, they were precise, they required no invented drama. When the room realized the depth of the documentation, murmurs rose. Victoria's face remained composed, while cameras caught the flicker in her eyes. Then Douglas took the stand, and the room slowed. He spoke plainly about memos and meetings, about a culture that had permitted casual theft when it suited one person's ambition. He did not act out revenge, he spoke facts and regret in the same sentence. By the time federal agents in plain clothes stood, ready with a warrant, the legal case had already unfolded in the quiet rooms of investigators and prosecutors. The arrest was not a cinematic showdown, it was a lawful procedure: handcuffs, Mirandized statements, careful notes. Cameras recorded the moment, and for once the public image of the humiliation that had opened Arthur's life was mirrored back with a different sound: the cold click of handcuffs and the media's careful language about charges and impending trials. Victoria was indicted for fraud and for misappropriation of intellectual property, charges that grew out of documentaries of evidence and a network of corroborating testimony. The prosecutors did their job, the courts did theirs. A conviction followed after a trial where facts were aired, witnesses were cross-examined, and the rule of law did exactly what it was designed to do: weigh, measure, and render a judgment based on evidence. Victoria was sentenced in accordance with applicable statutes, her sentence a product of the system Arthur had deferred to for so long. When it was over, the company was in flux. Some board members resigned quietly, others were ousted. Arthur did not thirst for a Pyrrhic revenge, he sought reconstruction. The first act of his majority control was pragmatic. He announced an internal audit, the correction of the patent record to properly attribute credit, and a robust restitution plan. He appointed a compliance officer, replaced opportunistic executives, and set in motion a program that would reassess every past award with an eye toward fairness. Names that had been erased were reinstated.
Plaques were adjusted with the patient hands of honest people. He renamed the company. It was not a gesture of spite. The new name honored the work Arthur believed had been stolen and celebrated a culture he wanted to build. But the piece that mattered most was not an announcement. It was a wing of a hospital, whose groundbreaking ceremony was the first time he allowed himself to say Eleanor's name in public without choking. The wing would be for research and treatment, memorial and practical, a place where medicine met mercy. He endowed it with funds beyond the minimum, insisting on affordable treatment and a program for patients whose families lacked insurance. There were clauses to ensure access and to prevent the kind of administrative red tape that had once interrupted his own wife's care. He also established a program in the company that mentored young engineers from community colleges and disadvantaged backgrounds, a scholarship in Eleanor's name that paid tuition and provided internships in labs that had been sanitized of ego. He required that credit be assigned transparently, that patents list contributors, that whistleblowers be protected. He led not with vengeance, but with structures that made the harm less likely to repeat. The boardroom where he'd once been escorted out with a cardboard box now held a plaque naming the Legacy Program and the Oncology Wing. A wall that had once displayed awards in Victoria's name was repurposed to showcase the small inventions and prototypes of engineers who had come through their program. Thomas, who had been the mathematical brain behind their patient purchases, moved from the role of strategist to something steadier, a leader who managed a new, reformed research division. He married a woman he had met through an internship program. They had a daughter who would toddle in and climb the steps to Eleanor's grave, as if the past and the future could finally hold hands. Publicly, Arthur was measured. He declined to speak in vindictive terms. In interviews, he said things like, "Justice is not spectacle, it is repair." Privately, he still had nights when he stirred in the early hours and wondered whether the cost had been too dear. Then he would visit the wing, see a nurse hold a child's hand, and remember why he had held on to the slow list of steps he had taken. In the years that followed, the company moved from a culture of credit hoarding to one of shared acknowledgement. Engineers received joint recognition for collaborative work. The HR department instituted clear mechanisms for recording contributions and for protecting innovators who might otherwise be rooted out of sight. Arthur made sure the message filtered down. Greatness is not the absence of mistakes. Greatness is the refusal to hide them.
There were critics. Some called his ascent poetic or said his patience should be lauded as a model. Others argued the system had nearly failed him and the chance had played too big a role.
Arthur accepted criticism the way a man accepts winter rain, something to be endured, learned from, and used to nourish what comes next. He never stopped carrying Eleanor's photograph in his wallet, slightly dog-eared now from years of handling. On the 15th anniversary of the day he had been escorted with a cardboard box, a magazine published a profile of the company under its new name. The cover pictured a small girl holding a model airplane from the mentorship program and smiling like the future. The headline read something cautious about reform. Inside, a long piece told the story of a man who had lost everything, and by the slow work of law and patience, had rebuilt a different kind of company. In the closing scene, Arthur attends a small family gathering at his son's home. Thomas's daughter, Eleanor's granddaughter, runs from the back of the yard, hair bright in the sun, and tumbles into his arms. The air smells faintly of spring. They stop by the grave later that afternoon, kneeling as if to set a small paper airplane on the stone. It is a quiet pilgrimage. Arthur puts his hand on the cool granite and hears, in memory, Eleanor's low laugh. He thinks of the cardboard box and how bluntly it had mapped the start of everything that followed. "If loyalty still matters to you, subscribe," he had said once, not as a sermon, but as an invitation. It was the same kind of appeal that undergirds his work now. Join the project of rebuilding trust. He believed then, as he believed now, that systems could be corrected without becoming instruments of personal vengeance. Laws enforced, institutions reformed, generosity restored. When Victoria's conviction was final and appeals exhausted, the legal record became part of the public archive. Arthur did not gloat at the sentence. He accepted the outcome as a necessary end to a painful chapter and focused on restitution, compensatory funds to those whose careers had been derailed, public acknowledgments, industry-wide conferences about intellectual credit and corporate ethics. The public conversation shifted, slowly, toward questions Arthur had long considered private. How to protect creators, how to structure recognition, how to build corporate cultures that encourage credit rather than suppress it. Not everyone forgave. Forgiveness was not what Arthur had sought. He had sought justice, and then repair. His satisfaction was not the rush of seeing an enemy falter. It was quieter. The sight of a research notebook with 3 names on the cover. The sight of a patient walking out of the cancer wing with a new set of life plans. The sight of Thomas teaching a freshman how to solder without cutting a finger. He kept his life small compared to the headlines. He worked late nights in a lab that smelled of oil and coffee, mentoring the kind of engineer Eleanor would have loved. Curious, plain-spoken, willing to test and to fail and to learn. He sat on the bench during some sessions and let young inventors speak.
He let the publicity settle into the background and made sure the company's culture did not. The last image is a simple one, a small grave by a hospital, a paper airplane perched on the headstone, and a little girl running back to a picnic, while her father, the son of the man who once carried a cardboard box, watches with an honest smile. Arthur stands, hands in the pockets of a worn coat, and for a moment the winter is an afterthought. The cardboard box was only the beginning. What followed was the slow, stubborn work of repairing a world torn by a lie. If patience and justice matter to you, share this story and subscribe.